Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the organizers and sponsors of this conference, I should like to welcome you. The title of our conference, Persecution and Protection of the Hungarian Jews, 1941-1945, is a highly topical issue and will be approached by a number of experts. Let me introduce myself. My name is Attila Pók, affiliated with the Hungarian Academy of Sciences and the Institute of Antallin Közeg, and I have the honor and privilege to chair the opening session. On the arrival, you got the abstracts and short bios of the participants. I am not going to take up time with long introduction, but right away, I should like to ask Professor László Borhi, rector of the university, which is our host today, to welcome our conference.
Monsignore, Nuncio Apostolico della Santa Sede in Ungheria, Votre Excellence, Ambassador de Suisse, kedves professzorok,
dear colleagues,
kedves
dear guests,
kollégák, kedves
it's a great honor for me
nagy
to
megtiszteltetés
today's
számomra,
conference
hogy üdvözölhetem Önöket a mai
entitled
konferencián, amely
The Persecution and Protection of Hungarian Jews between 1945. We have gathered here today to commemorate and learn together about the Holocaust, these tragic events which represent the darkest chapters of our history, so namely the Holocaust. The fate that befell the Hungarian Jewish population during the Second World War was one of the greatest disasters of humanity worldwide. We must remember how the dark days of history unfolded, how millions lived through a nightmare that fundamentally changed not only the lives of those affected, but also the social value system altogether. At the same time, we should not forget about the heroes who persevered not only amid the great calamity, but also in the face of human cruelty, struggling valiantly to save lives and prevent further suffering. Today, we are engaging in a dialogue about these historical events, examining them from a scientific perspective. The conference aims to delve deeper into the respective historical and ethical issues, to understand what circumstances led to the tragedy of the Jewish population in Hungary, how the series of rescue attempts were carried out, and how the past can be processed to provide lessons for the future. History is not only concerned with the past, but also with how we can learn from the mistakes made in the past and create a better and fairer future. I would like to thank our speakers in particular, whose scholarly work contributes to a better understanding of this bleak side of history. Without their work, it would not be possible to commemorate and honor the victims with dignity. I am confident that at this conference we will not only broaden our knowledge, but also assume a moral responsibility so that we would never forget the lessons of history. Please allow me to wish all the conference participants rich and useful discussions, in-depth discourse and new insights. I expect and I do hope that all of us will gain invaluable experience, bringing us closer to understanding the past and the social responsibility, not only scientifically, but also on a human level. This day is for commemoration, paying tribute and learning together. Let us take our historical responsibility seriously and do our utmost to ensure that such horrors cannot happen again. Thank you for joining us for this important event, and I wish you valuable and fruitful work throughout the conference. Thank you very much for your kind attention. Thank you very much, dear Rector, and thank you very much for ELTE University for hosting this event. So, we will be able to hear welcoming words from Monsignor Michael W. Banach, Apostolic Nuncio, Dean of the Diplomatic Corps in Hungary. It's a great honor indeed for us that he is going to welcome the conference.
"75 years ago, this nation witnessed the final destruction of the Vilnius ghetto. This was the climax of the killing of thousands of Jews that had started 2 years earlier. As we read in the Book of Wisdom, the Jewish people suffered insults and cruel punishments. Let us think back on those times and ask the Lord to give us the gift of discernment, to detect in time any recrudescence of that pernicious attitude, any whiff of it that can taint the heart of generations that did not experience those times and can sometimes be taken in by such siren songs." Dear participants in this symposium dedicated to persecution and protection of Hungarian Jews, 1941-1945, the just quoted words of Pope Francis, spoken on the occasion of his pastoral visit to Lithuania in 2018, could easily be applied to Hungary and to the proceedings of today's symposium. In reflecting on the protection measures and remembering the courageous efforts of various actors, many of whom remain anonymous to this very day, we ask for the gift of discernment, so that we too may detect in time any recrudescence of that pernicious attitude, any whiff of it that can taint our hearts. And what a pernicious attitude it was. On the 20th of January 1942, leading Nazi officials met at the Wannsee Conference Villa in Wannsee, a southeastern suburb of Berlin. The conference had been called to discuss and coordinate a cheaper, more efficient, and permanent solution to the Nazis' Jewish problem. The conference was attended by senior government and SS officials and coordinated by Reinhard Heydrich. And at the meeting, Heydrich gave a review of the Nazis' Jewish policy, highlighting the recent removal of the Jews from the German Reich and framing it as a temporary solution to the larger Jewish problem. The final solution for the 11 million Jews remaining in Europe, as laid out by Heydrich, was to utilize them for work in the East on roadworks. Those who could not work or became unable to work after a period of time would be subject to special treatment. The Nazis used the term special treatment as a euphemism for murder. At the conference, there was also some discussion on the methods of mass murder, although concrete plans were never established then. And whilst the exact methods were not laid out, it played a significant role in coordinating the Nazis' genocidal actions. The policy of annihilation to be taken against the Jews was made extremely clear by Nazi leadership, and by the end of 1942, 6 extermination camps were in operation. And these discussions and policy decisions had almost immediate effects on Hungary. Hungary had been an ally of Germany, but German defeats and mounting Hungarian losses led Hungary to seek an armistice with Western allies. To forestall these peacemakers, German forces occupied Hungary on March 19, 1944, and forced the regent of Hungary, Miklos Horthy, to appoint a pro-German government. And the Szocai government was prepared not only to continue the war, but also to deport Hungarian Jews to German-occupied Poland. And shortly after the occupation, Hungarian officials began to round up Hungarian Jews and to transfer them to German custody. By July 1944, the Hungarians and Germans had deported nearly 420,000 Jews from Hungary, almost all of them to Auschwitz-Birkenau, where the SS killed approximately 320,000 of them upon their arrival, and deployed the rest at forced labor in Auschwitz and other camps. By the end of the Holocaust, some 560,000 Hungarian Jews had been murdered. It's estimated that nearly 200,000 Jews remained in Budapest. The Hungarian authorities intended to deport them as well in compliance with German requests. But after the Hungarian fascist Arrow Cross movement seized power with the help of the Germans on October 15, 1944, the Arrow Cross government resumed the deportation of Hungarian Jews, which Horthy, at the behest of, among others, Pope Pius XII, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and King Gustav V of Sweden, had halted in July before the Budapest Jews could be deported. As Soviet troops had already cut off rail transports to Auschwitz, Hungarian authorities forced tens of thousands of Budapest Jews to march west to the Hungarian border with Austria. And in the midst of this darkness, or night, as Elie Wiesel called it, several courageous individuals repeatedly and personally intervened to secure the release of those with certificates of protection or forged papers, saving as many people as they could from the marching columns. Certificates of protection and immigration were issued. Hospitals, nurseries, and soup kitchens were established. Safe houses were designated that together formed the international ghetto in Budapest, also reserved for Jews and for their families holding certificates of protection from a neutral country. And how many rescue operations were undertaken? Well, who were these courageous individuals? The Swiss diplomat Raoul Wallenberg, the Vice Consul General in the Swiss legation Karl Lutz, together with Harold Feller, the Italian businessman Giorgio Perlasca, posing as a Spanish diplomat, closely assisted by Laszlo and Eugenia Shamoshi, who issued to many Jews in Budapest certificates of protection for nations whose interests neutral Spain represented, and established safe houses, including one for Jewish children. Angel Sainz Briz of the Spanish legation, Otto Komoyi, leader of the Aid to the Rescue Committee, credited with saving thousands of Jewish children during the German occupation of Budapest, together with Rudolf Kastner. Sister Margaret Slachta, who coupled zeal for social justice and religious convictions in rescue and relief efforts. Sister Sarah Salkhazi, executed by Arrow Cross for rescuing Jewish girls. The Salesian priest Mihai Kish, Archbishop Angelo Rota, Apostolic Nuncio, and Monsignor Angelo Verolino, counselor of the Nunciature, who saved many Jews using the arms of diplomacy and the deceptions of justice. We need to hear about these and other actors. We need to be inspired by these men and women before whom humanity has a debt of gratitude impossible to repay. In the face of the risk of a resurgence and spread of anti-Semitic feelings, attitudes, and initiatives, of which certain disquieting signs can be seen today, and of which we have experienced the most frightful results in the past, we need to remember their example in order to teach consciences to consider anti-Semitism and all forms of racism, to use my language, as sins against God and humanity. In remembering their example and courage, we can see that in the midst of death, life persists. In the midst of untruth, truth persists. In the midst of darkness, light persists. For where there are light and truth and life, there is no place for any recrudescence of that pernicious attitude, any whiff of it that can taint the heart of generations. The great Hungarian Jew and chief rabbi of Hungary, Simon Hevesi, who died in 1943, before Hungary became the last victim of Nazi tyranny, composed a prayer at the end of 1941. Some of those words are, "Almighty and wonder-working God, I believe in the miracle of history. I believe that thou hast worked wonders with Hungary, our beloved nation, and shalt work wonders forever. May thou keep and protect her, and may thy mercy, like a golden bridge, glitter over her. May we be allowed to witness the coming of better times, to contribute with exemplary moral conduct and the purity of our daily lives to the realization of a higher moral ideal in which the salvation of mankind and our nation is hidden, and the brightness of which emanates from thy sacred teaching. Sacred holidays are at hand. The present shall soon be past on the wings of time. The new year is upon us. We raise our countenance toward thee. Look down upon us. Write mankind into the book of happiness. Our Father, our King, grant us a happy new year. Amen. So let these sentiments be the dream and wishes for our deliberations today. Wonders forever, better times, high moral ideals, and inclusion in the book of happiness. Thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you very much for your most insightful words. Most pedig két bevezető előadás következik.
And now two introductory speeches. The first speaker is going to be delivered by László Karsai, Professor Emeritus from the University of Szeged, who is going to give us a description of the Holocaust in Hungary. The floor is yours.
Elnök úr,
Chair,
Rektor úr,
Rector,
Nuncius úr,
Nuncio,
és asszonyok,
Madam and
megtisztelő meghívást.
Mr. Ambassadors, thank you so much for the
Előadásom
kind
címe
invitation.
Akciók a budapesti
The
zsidók
title of
megmentésére.
my presentation is Actions for the Savior,
Kezdjük
for the
talán a
rescue of Hungarian Jews. So let me start off perhaps
legfontosabb
with the most important
adatokkal.
data.
Sajnos a gyönyörűséges táblázatomat
Unfortunately,
három képre tudtam csak
this
elosztani.
beautiful table of
De
mine
kérem, hogy
is going to be shared on
nézzék
three slides, so please
Most
listen
jövünk
attentively.
mi. Középtájon
So
vagyunk.
here we are, somewhere in the middle, Hungary,
emberveszteségek
in terms of the loss of lives,
mutatom
loss
be
of
ezeket
souls,
a
and I'm showing you the
nem
percentage
ABC
rates.
sorrendben,
This is
és
not
ha
an alphabetical
bárkinek
order.
kérdése
So should
lenne,
you have any
hogy
questions
miért ennyi, miért
regarding
csak annyi,
why
miért
just
sok,
why this
szívesen
many, why the so
válaszolok majd
little,
a
etc.,
kérdésekre.
I'm happy to answer all your questions related to the figures as well. Hungarian data
az
refer
1938 és 41 közötti
to
több
the
szakaszban
stages
megnövekedett
between
országterületre
1938 and
vonatkoznak.
41. There is no correlation between the number of survivors and the number of those recognized by Yad Vashem as the righteous among the nations. What is more important for us now are the survivors. So what we know for sure is that at least 200,000 Jews lived in Budapest in 1944, of whom 135 to 150,000 survived the Holocaust. There is no other ghetto in Europe, actually two in the Hungarian capital, where so many Jews survived the Holocaust. In the large ghetto, there was approximately 70,000. In this small ghetto, in the international ghetto, there were approximately 30,000 Jews who managed to live through the liberation. The rest were hidden or concealed. So to what do we and to whom we attribute the relatively high number of survivors? If you ask those who were eager to see the canonization of Pope Pius XII, it was because on the 25th of June 1944 the Holy Father sent a telegram to the governor, Miklós Horthy, who was actually reformed. The governor, got so shocked that he stopped the deportations on the 6th of July. The supporters of today of the Pope generously disregard the fact that for almost 2 weeks after receiving the telegram, the governor continued to ponder and hesitate why thousands of Jews were deported from Hungary to Auschwitz every day by 2 to 3 trains. So let us turn our attention to the alleged chief savior of the Jews of Pest, the governor. The Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán considers him exceptional statesman but became an accomplice of the Nazi mass murderers. László Kövér, president of the parliament, says that governor deployed his army to protect the Jews. Kövér has simply calls communists those who claim that Colonel Ferenc Koszorús and his Panzer Corps did nothing to prevent the deportation of Jews on the 7th of July 1944. What is a fact, 437 rural Jews were deported with the governor's approval from the 15th of May to the 9th of July 1944. Most of them were sent to Auschwitz-Birkenau, where about 80% of them were murdered. Horthy, just like Pope Pius XII, had precise, detailed information that the Nazis were massacring Jews on a massive scale throughout Europe since 1942. It is not true that he suspended the deportations because his daughter-in-law showed the so-called Auschwitz protocols under his nose at noon on the 2nd of July 1944. So those who believe that the governor knew nothing about the massacre of millions of European Jews until 1944 just do not understand that one of the reasons why Horthy did not allow the deportation of Hungarian Jews until 1944 was because he knew the essence of the Nazis' politics towards the Jews. He also refrained from deporting hundreds of thousands of Jews to their deaths until the German occupation for humanitarian reasons. He also feared socio-economic disruption if Jews were deported from Hungary, and in the face of a deteriorating military situation, he did not want to score further bad points in Moscow, London and Washington. He also believed, we now know he was wrong, that the leaders of the anti-fascist superpowers were interested in what was happening to the Jews in the European territories occupied by the Nazis. Horthy knew that Mussolini did not allow the deportation of Italian Jews until the summer of 1943, and that the Jews were safe elsewhere in the Italian-occupied territories. While Mussolini and his generals, with his tacit approval, protected the Jews, Horthy had someone to blame when he refused to allow the deportation of Hungarian Jews. Budapest knew that no more Jews had been deported from the Slovak puppet state since the autumn of 1942. Even the Romanian dictator Ion Antonescu changed his mind after the massacre and deportation of hundreds of thousands of Jews from the southern Transylvanian and old Romanian territories. He did not allow further deportations. The Hungarian government, led by Miklós Kállai between 1942 and 1944, took the Nazis by surprise because they were pro-Jewish. In 1920, Hungary's legislators were the first in post-World War I Europe to pass an anti-Semitic law, the numerous clauses which restricted the further education of Jews at universities and colleges. From 1938 to 1942, 23 laws and hundreds of decrees made Hungarian Jews second-class citizens and restricted their voting rights. The sexual relations of a Jewish man with a non-Jewish woman were considered racially discriminatory. Hundreds of thousands of acres of land owned by Jews were nationalized at ridiculously cheap prices. Many Jews were disbarred, and their numbers in the bar, medical and engineering professions were restricted. The lives of the majority of Hungarian Jews were not in danger until the German occupation. Their numbers were reduced by the deportations of 1941. Some 16,000 Jews were driven into German-occupied Ukrainian territory, where most of them were slaughtered. In the January 1942, the massacre in Novi Sad, some 3,000 people were murdered, including about 1,000 Jews. We must also mention the approximately 25 to 30,000 victims of the unarmed, humiliating slave labor. So after the German occupation, the governor stepped aside and gave a free hand in the Jewish question to the Stolyai government he had appointed. And it's going to be not nice what I'm going to say. So it was not the Germans who forced the Stolyai government. Sorry, Nuncio. Horthy insisted that Stolyai would be made the head of the government. The Germans wanted Imredi and some other extremists. Excuse me for the correction. Horthy's supporters are profoundly silent about the fact that in August 1944, the governor again allowed the deportations to continue, with the deportation trains leaving again on the 25th of August. The only reason why this did not happen was that on the 23rd of August, Antonescu's rule was overthrown in Bucharest, and the Romanian army defected, and the Wehrmacht suffered one of the greatest defeats in the history of the Second World War. Every wagon, every lorry, every able-bodied man had to be rescued from the southeastern front, and the remaining troops had to be pulled back. An important question is why, on the 6th of July 1944, Horthy ordered the gendarmerie units that had been ordered to the capital in the previous weeks to leave. It is certain that the main reason for his decision was not to save the Jews of Budapest. Perhaps he had finally realized that the Anglo-Saxon troops had broken out of the Normandy bridgehead, that Operation Bulgarian had been unfolding in the east since mid-June, and that the Red Army had advanced hundreds of kilometers in a matter of weeks. The governor was also influenced by the protests of the Pope, King of Sweden, the President of the United States, and many influential secular and religious figures in Hungary. The Auschwitz protocols also attracted enormous attention in the press of neutral countries. The detailed accounts of the death camp caused a worldwide scandal, and the Jews and the news made the residents of the royal palace in Buda very uncomfortable. He also believed two rumors that were completely unfounded. He believed that if the Jews were removed from the Yellow Star houses, then the capital would be carpet bombed by the Allies. On the other hand, for a few days, he also believed that some 3,000 gendarmes had been ordered to Budapest by László Baki, the State Secretary of the Interior, to overthrow his authority, and that was why he had the gendarmes, who were fanatically loyal to him, moved back to their barracks. It is also worth remembering that if Adolf Eichmann had not arrived in Budapest on Himmler's precise orders and had had the opportunity to take the advice of the other State Secretary for the Interior, László Endre, the deportations would have begun in Budapest, and all the Jews of the capital would have been taken away in a few weeks. The Reichsführer of the SS decided to start the deportations in the outskirts, leaving the deportation of the Jews in the capital for the last time. So, the Jews of Pest left, all of whom after the Arrow Cross coup, 15th of October 1944, Ferenc Szálasi wanted to slaughter. This was only or mainly prevented by neutral diplomats. They deceived the Arrow Cross leader, making him believe that the letters of protection and protective passports issued by them were valid in terms of international law. There is something infinitely heartwarming about this myth. A few brave, heroic diplomats start to mass-produce, sign, stamp, issue, distribute these letters of transit protective passports. The savage, bloodthirsty arrow cross activists, if they see a document proving foreign citizenship or immunity at a street checkpoint, they salute and let the Jew go on his way in a disciplined manner. If one takes the trouble, I did it years ago, and just looks up the relevant Wikipedia entries, one can find out that Swiss Vice Consul Karl Lutz saved about 60,000 Jews. Swedish Embassy Secretary Raoul Wallenberg saved about another 60,000. Zionist resistance saved about 120,000. Christian churches saved about 140,000. Diplomats from the Vatican, Spain, Portugal, El Salvador, etc. and the International Red Cross saved thousands and tens of thousands of Jews each. So out of the 200,000, at least 420,000 140,000 were saved. And we should not forget the 30,000 or so Jews who survived the arrow cross terror with the help of Christian, non-Jewish friends, acquaintances, colleagues. Much of the older Hungarian and international literature on the subject depicts the events almost exclusively as a struggle between neutral diplomats and the arrow cross and Nazis. Ferenc Szálasi was portrayed and preserved in the older literature and historical memory as a bloodthirsty enemy of the Jews. If this is true, why did he hesitate, and hesitate for 2 weeks after coming to power? Why did he only authorize the deportation of some of the Jews of the capital to labor service on the 3rd of November 1944? Some 50,000 Jews were drafted to build the fortifications on the western frontier to protect Vienna. On the 21st of November, Szálasi stopped the death marches and, ignoring the protests of the Germans, organized the international and the large ghettos. So would the cunning diplomats have led Szálasi to believe that the letters of protection and safe conduct they had issued were valid under international law? Wrong. As early as the 20th of October, the German ambassador with full powers, Edmund Wesenmayer, informed Foreign Minister Gábor Kemény in a lengthy memorandum that the various foreign protection passports issued after the 19th of March and certifying citizenship had been ignored as contrary to international law. Now please everyone take a look at the Swedish crown. You can see the 3 crowns and you can see the order. Then take a look at the brave, heroic diplomats. And take a look at the 3 crowns. So there is not a single border guard in Sweden who would allow anyone in with a coat of arms having 2 crowns. So Prime Minister Döme Stolyai enthusiastically placed the entire Hungarian apparatus of violence at the disposal of the Nazi deportation forces, along with tens of thousands of officials, teachers, railwaymen, doctors, etc., who participated in the total robbery and ghettoization and deportation of the Jews. At the end of the August 1944, Eichmann himself realized that even Himmler did not consider it important to continue the deportations of Hungary. He flew back to Berlin in disappointment. After the Arrow Cross coup, he was happy to rush back to Budapest, hoping to finally deport the Jews of the capital. He was deeply disappointed. As mentioned above, the death marches to the western border could only start on the 3rd of November. Szálasi, and perhaps his contemporary Eichmann, did not know this at the time, just as many Hungarian Holocaust experts today do, was not an anti-Semite, but he was an Esemite. He wanted to remove all Jews from Hungary, but only after the war. From 1938 onwards, the Arrow Cross criticized the successive Jewish laws from the extreme. They demanded total nationalization. They wanted to introduce a socialist type of planned economy, and they did not want to restrict the rights of the Jews, but to expel them, to remove them, all Jews, but only after the war. After the German occupation occupation, Szálasi repeatedly criticized the Sztójai government's Jewish policy. In public, he regretted the fact that hundreds of thousands of useful Jewish workers were being handed over to the Germans. He did not waste a single word on the fact that it was precisely Jewish men who were not handed over to the Nazis by the Ministry of Defense, so that the majority of those deported were women, old, small children and sick. However, he forbade the Arrow Cross to take anything from the property left behind by the Jews, or to claim ownerless property. Among other things, he stated that, I quote, "The most disgusting fact of Jewish property is taking place today. From rings to huge valuables, everything is worth 30 cents of a dog."
On the 26th of October, the German ambassador in Budapest, Edmund Wesenmayer, the plenipotentiary, had already reported that the Arrow Cross had removed 25,000 men and 10,000 women from the capital. They had been employed in fortification work around Budapest, while the Germans wanted the Jews to be removed not only from the capital but also from the country, in other words, deported. In the Arrow Cross Party's so-called first plan for the building of the nation of the 17th of October, it was already stated that, let me quote, "The Jews would remain in Hungary doing labor service for the nation," unquote. The plan that was finally made public, however, already stated that, I quote, "The Jews will perform labor service for the nation. After the end of the war, the Jews will be removed from Hungary to a place designated by international agreement. The Jews will never be allowed to return to the Hungarian sphere of life," end of quote. Between the 17th and the 22nd of October, Szálasi was thus persuaded that Jews could perform labor service for the Hungarian nation even if they did not do so on the territory of the country. This wording, however, reflects the fact that Szálasi still stuck to his old idea. The deportation of the Jews could only take place after the end of the war. For days after the Arrow Cross takeover, German officials believed that Szálasi would immediately send the Jews who were able to work to the Greater German Reich, and that the other Jews would be forced into ghettos and then deported. Eichmann wanted to confine the Jews of the capital, I quote, "ghetto-like camps in the outskirts of the city," unquote, essentially reviving the August 1944 deportation plan. On the 18th of October, Wesenmayer had already written in his report about 4 camps near Budapest, either on the periphery of the city or in its outer districts. 2 days later, he enthusiastically reported to Ribbentrop, and let me quote, "Arrangements are proceeding apace for the rounding up of the Jews who are unable to work into the ghetto, which will be implemented in a few days for the time being on a provisional basis," unquote. Reichmann's ally might have been Gábor Vajna, Minister of Interior, had Szálasi not reserved the right to decide on this matter for himself. Vajna tried to help Eichmann, but the head of the nation, eager for official recognition as a neutral state, ultimately refused to allow the Jews to be herded into ghettos in the outskirts of the city. On the other hand, he recognized international protection passports, and thirdly, he stopped the death marches on the 21st of November. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, he organized the 2 inner-city ghettos. Food for the large ghetto was provided from the capital's food stocks. The daily ration, if it reached the starving inmates of the ghetto at all, was about 800–900 calories per head. If this had been given to everyone and every day, it would have been enough to survive. Since the inmates of the large ghetto could not do heavy, strenuous physical work, this amount of calories would in principle have been enough on average. From the 15th of October 1944, the Arrow Cross bandits went on a rampage in the besieged capital, robbing and murdering Jews in a series of massacres. During the 95 days of the Arrow Cross terror, the number of Jewish victims was estimated at 8,000 to 12,000. Let us not forget that this is how many Hungarian Jews were killed in a single day at Auschwitz-Birkenau. What is the real meaning, or what was the real meaning of a passport or a protected passport certifying foreign citizenship? According to the testimony of many survivors, even the lowest quality Swiss passport could save a life in a single deportation. Even the best Vatican or Spanish passports could not have saved lives of Jewish men when it came to the so-called trousers test. Large-scale document forgery compromised the value of all patents. The ELTE knew that the neutral states had approved a total of 15,000 letters of transit or letters of protection, but they had seen and experienced that at least 30 to 40,000 Jews had taken refuge in the houses around St. Stephen's Park. It was not only the street justification that were life-threatening. Jews and Aryans were taken from their homes and from protected houses and even embassy buildings. Protected documents were often torn up, their owners robbed, women and girls were raped, beaten and shot. Without a necklace, it was mainly Swiss and Swedish letters of protection that were forged by Zionist registers. In principle, Spanish, Vatican and Portuguese letters of transit or letters of protection would have been worth more. The Jewish officials in the embassies did not want to move into the houses in the international ghetto either, because they knew that they were prime targets for the Arab bandits. The latter believed, with good reason, that the richer Jews with the best social connections had fled to the ghettos. They took Jews and Aryan, Yugoslavs, Swedes, Estonian Swedes, anyone from the city and the international ghetto into the big ghetto with a ministerial passport, a valid passport, a passport for protection, a Swedish service passport, or Italian diplomatic passport. It is almost impossible to determine exactly how many houses were placed under the protection of each neutral embassy. The three official statements available to us show a dynamic increase in the number of houses under protection. While the first list, dated 14th of November 1944, lists only 11 Swiss, 1 Spanish, 1 Vatican, 1 Swedish house. The list at the end of November lists 4 Vatican, 11 Swedish and 30 Swiss houses, and the last list lists 6 Vatican, 20 Swedish and 42 Swiss houses. New sheltered houses have also been added to the list. The Portuguese embassy has received 4 in 2 tranches, the International Red Cross 3, and the Governorate and Interior Ministry sheltered houses have also received 3 houses in the international ghetto. It is not known who arranged for even the Argentinian proteges to receive a house on Tatra Street. This is only interesting because from January 1946, the Latin American countries were also at war with Hungary. It is certain that even more houses were placed under the protection of embassies of neutral states in Budapest during November. On the 28th of November 1944, the occupants of the house at 15 Visegrádi Street were still residents of the Swiss protected house at 31 Holland Street the day they were evicted from this house and moved to St. Stephen's Park. The Swiss embassy had at least 77 buildings under its protection. The Swedish at last 36. The official list mentioned previously do not include buildings outside the international ghetto, which were also under the protection of the various neutral embassies, such as the so-called Glass House at the 29 Voda Street, the Center for Zionist Resistance and Document Forgers, or the dozens of buildings under the protection of the International Committee of the Red Cross. The latter were used for children's and infants' homes, hospitals, and the Budapest offices of the International Committee of the Red Cross. On the 27th of November, Foreign Minister Gábor Kemény told the representatives of Budapest that the government felt it could take care of the elderly, the sick, and the young children itself, and that the delegates should therefore stop protecting various buildings. The question is why Friedrich Born, the Red Cross representative of Budapest, was not warned about from the 15th of October. Szálasi, after the majority of the neutral states had refused to recognize his regime, de jure ordered the evacuation of the children's homes under the protection Vaki and an association. The children and infants, together with their caretakers, were moved to the large ghetto. In his protest note, Born denounced the other Red Cross organization to the Arrow Cross. He stated that the international Red Cross movement's activities were, and here I quote, by no means exclusively in the interest of the Jews, but merely a part of the action of the humanitarian. In this, it differs from the foreign Red Crosses operating in Hungary, which specialize almost exclusively in Jewish affairs, which is no longer natural since they belong to the foreign missions of neutral states here, and thus unwittingly introduce politics into Red Cross affairs. End of quote. Like Born, Karl Lutz, the Swiss vice consul, did not hesitate to inform the Hungarian Foreign Affairs authorities on the 23rd of October that, and I quote, the Swiss protecting power issues protection passports only to nationals of foreign powers it represents and expects these protection passports to be recognized by the Hungarian authorities. End of quote. In true attention to the fact that the Swiss Schutzpass should not be confused with the Swedish Schutzpass, because the Swedish embassy in Budapest did not follow the same strict principles as the Swiss embassy in issuing them, and thus in some cases Hungarian citizens had access to such documents. The Hungarian authorities were aware the Zionist resistance fighters were also operating under the protection of the Swiss embassy and the Red Cross movement. Only Spain, Turkey, which was wary of saving people, and the Vatican recognized the Szálasi regime. And then there was the nuncio in Budapest, Angelo Roccia, who pretended that the Holy See also regarded the head of state as a legitimate head of state. To put it mildly, he did not reveal the whole truth. More bluntly, he lied. No one on the banks of the Tevere even suspected that in defense of the Jews, the Monsignor was able to deceive the Arrow Cross. In the early days of the Arrow Cross rule, if disciplined police officers guarded Jewish houses, they were a veritable refuge. Some of these policemen and their officers knew that the war had been lost to the Germans. By protecting Jewish houses, for example, the Jewish Council headquarters in Sheep Street, even though based on the regulations of their bosses, they saved the lives of many people. Officials, policemen and soldiers who sometimes obeyed the Arrow Cross only with a wave of the arrow and who defined some of their orders, remember that between March and October 1944, for the third time in a row, the official Hungarian government policy towards the Jews changed. After the fall of the Stolyai government in August-September 1944, the Jews could breathe a sigh of relief under the premiership of Kéza Lakatos. It should also be taken into account that when a so-called Jew hater or someone who had previously been indifferent suddenly started helping Jews, in many cases they were trying to gain some good points for themselves for the post-liberation period to provide some rescue students. It is no coincidence that the vast majority of the almost 900 Hungarian righteous among the nations received this honor for their courageous life-saving activities during the Arrow Cross terror. The question posed in the introduction to whom and to what factors it is due that approximately 135,000, 150,000 Jews in Budapest survived the Arrow Cross can be answered. If Szálasi had not recognized the international letters of protection and protective passports, Lutz, Wallenberg and their fellow diplomats could have done nothing. If Szálasi had allowed the deportation of the Jews of Budapest and had not organized the two ghettos, only a fraction of the Jews of Budapest could have survived the Holocaust. If Hungarian and German troops had not defended the capital against the Red Army so fiercely, thousands fewer Jews would have died. Szálasi soon learned that members of his party and movement, as well as individuals with Arrow Cross armbands and weapons, were killing, robbing and stealing throughout the city. Sometime in the last days of October, he therefore went at least as far as to go down to the castle to 60 Andrássy Avenue and made a speech to the brothers working at the party headquarters. Among other things, he declared that those who fall victim to excesses will pay with their lives. In mid-December, Chief Rabbi Béla Berend, a member of the Jewish Council, called on the Arrow Cross authorities to, and I quote, stop all atrocities committed to bandits and armbands because these cruel murders of the terrified, defenseless, persecuted Jews will forever stain the name of the Arrow Cross Party and of Hungary before the entire educated humanity and the world public opinion." End of quote. The international ghetto is also known in the literature as the protected ghetto. It is difficult to understand why. People began to flee from this ghetto to the large ghetto as early as at the end of December 1944. By the beginning of January 1945, thousands of people were pouring into the houses around Veselényi Street, Dov Street, Klauzál Square every day. From mid-December onwards, the large ghetto was guarded by a mixed police and Air Cross guards who managed to prevent robberies and mass murders on several occasions. The Red Army, which was besieging the capital, was not the only force the Jews could rely on. They did not owe their lives to the truly heroic neutral diplomats who saved people. Even the SS Reichsführer Heinrich Himmler himself was inclined to spare the lives of small or large groups of Jews in order to ensure the success of his efforts to save them. Of those deported to Nazi camps in the countryside in the spring and early summer of 1944, those who returned home did not owe their lives to Szálasi, and the prisoners of the Budapest ghetto survived the siege only because Red Army soldiers drove German and Hungarian soldiers from the Pest side of the Danube on the 18th of January 1945. The Jews of the capital had a better chance of survival under the Air Cross regime than their rural counterparts under the Stolyai government appointed by Governor Miklós Horthy. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much. I would like to raise your attention to the fact that you will have the opportunity to raise questions and make comments after the second presentation. And let me kindly call your attention to the fact that there is an exhibition behind.
Our next speaker is Jean-François Parrot, historian and diplomat, who has devoted a large amount of time and energy during the last couple of years to the problems that we are dealing with today. His Excellency, your floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Professor. It's a privilege for me to be here this morning with eminent historians and researchers. Of course, it is not easy to speak after Professor Karjai, but I am happy to say that we are basically, we have the same opinion on several questions which are of interest for us today. Let us see if I can show the PowerPoint. It was said I am a diplomat here in Hungary, a trained historian, but you will not be astonished that I want to speak about these protections under the perspective of international diplomacy. My contribution today aims at showing how the protection efforts in favor of the Jewish populations of Budapest achieved some results, not because some individual diplomats managed to outsmart the Hungarian or German perpetrators, but because they were part of an international humanitarian diplomacy which at some crucial points influenced the behavior of the Hungarian and German governments and the various other authors of the Holocaust. The neutral diplomats who played a major role in this operation, we have found on the slides, were not the only diplomats during the Second World War who rescued and protected Jews. For instance, we have Aristides de Souza Mendes in Bordeaux, Ciuneșu Viera in Kaunas, Lithuania, and many others. They distributed visa illegally so that Jewish refugees might travel to secure countries. And therefore, there is a tendency or temptation to consider that all those diplomats acted the same way. According to Yad Vashem, their method of rescue for all of them is the provision of fake papers. Until today, we can consider a legislative act under consideration of the United States Congress, which is being considered now, that aims at honoring more than 60 diplomats, 20 of whom are engaged in the protection efforts in Budapest. And they say, we see it on the slide, these diplomats had strict orders from their home countries to not aid the Jewish population in any way. And then they say they were issuing passports and travel visa contrary to the instructions of their government. So this is a serious issue because it is claimed that the governments of these diplomats were against saving Jews, and the instructions were violated. My research is in the last years in the diplomatic archives of several states, in particular the United States War Refugee Board archive that Dr. Alash has also searched, and the Swiss diplomatic archive show that this vision does not be correct. No single diplomat stopped the train to Auschwitz, designed from his own initiative the modalities of instruments of a comprehensive rescue plan, or fooled the Hungarian or German authorities by using a ruse, interpreting the 8,000 holders of Palestine certificates not as individuals but families, and thus increasing the number to 40,000. If we stick to this narrative of individual action conducted against the instructions, we miss essential keys to understand the specific nature, the uniqueness of the protection operation in Budapest. We must be aware, and Professor Karjai said that the fate of the Hungarian Jews was not determined by the actions of the few individual diplomats, but by the policies of the Hungarian state, by the relations between the Hungarian and German governments, and by the evolution of the war, since the Jews of Budapest ultimately were saved by the soldiers of the Red Army. But my point is that an international humanitarian diplomacy managed at some crucial points to influence the behavior of the Hungarian and German governments and various actors of persecution. Let us see now how and why. The principal first element is that it is a collective action, and second, it is an international action. Contrary to other righteous diplomats who acted in isolated consular posts, in Budapest, the operation involved 6 heads of mission and the staff of 6 embassies. We can see we have 20 diplomats on this slide, 18 of them of whom have been recognized as righteous among the nations. It is a collective operation, and some of the members of this diplomatic community have special responsibilities, mainly the apostolic nuncio. He has a high moral stature, he is in relation with the church organizations in Hungary, but he is also the dean of the diplomatic corps, a position which enabled him to take a leading role in collective diplomatic démarches. Sweden and Switzerland represent the interests of the main allied powers, and these main allied powers, they are about to win the war. The head of mission of Switzerland and Sweden, Jäger, Danielsson, have a special authority, they have special competencies. They can transmit political messages at the highest level of the Hungarian state on behalf of the allied powers they represent. My colleagues, ambassadors in this room, and myself, we don't have access to the highest level of the state nowadays, so often, at that time, they could be received by Orti, by Stoza, by Salasi, by Kemeny, etc. They have also consular duties with regard to the citizens of the big allies powers. They are important diplomatic actors at the precise moment when the persecution of the Jews finally becomes a real object of intervention in international relations. But they are state actors in the Hungarian capital who also have very close contacts and cooperation with well-connected non-state actors as partners. They work with the member of the Jewish Aid and Rescue Committee of Budapest, and they have an institutional relation with them. After the German occupation, the head of the Palestine office, Moshe Kraus, becomes head of the Emigration Office in the division for the protection of foreign interest in the Swiss legation, and Reze Kastner and Otto Komoy cooperate with Friedrich Born. Otto Komoy becomes the head of the Section A of the ICRC delegation in charge of the assistance to persecuted Jews. Furthermore, the protection operation is not only collective, but it is an international humanitarian diplomacy, and we have a significant moment when there is a decision to create the War Refugee Board in January 1944. This executive order of President Roosevelt is a result of a strong pressure from the main Jewish organizations, and it represents a new goal, a new foreign policy objective for the United States, which is to save as many Jews as possible from the remaining Jewish population in Europe. As we can see, they decide in the executive order that they have to create an international coalition of the willing with private organizations, state agencies, and also with foreign governments. So we have a new architecture for the rescue. When we look at a charter I have developed, we can see that we have a strong international dimension. We have the operational base in Budapest, where we have our righteous among the nations diplomat, their cooperation with the representative of the Aid and Rescue Committee. But this action basically is accompanied remotely by a main political decision center in Washington. It is the War Refugee Board, and the War Refugee Board is in contact with the big American Jewish organization like the World Jewish Congress. Interestingly, they decide to have representatives in several neutral countries. We have Roosevelt McClelland in Bern, Ivar Olsen in Sweden, and Ira Hirschman in Ankara. Switzerland, as early as May 1944, is the main operational coordination center for the efforts of the War Refugee Board, and it is not the Swiss government who is in the driving seat, but the American legation. They have established a young man, 32 years old, Roosevelt McClelland, who comes from the NGO world. He was acting in Italy, in France, and he continues to live in Geneva, but he works in Bern. And there, he builds a very close partnership with the Jewish organizations in Geneva, where we have many actors, Jewish actors of the international efforts, like Rigner of the World Jewish Congress, or Sally Meyer, who will be negotiating with the Nazi Kurt Becher. He also cooperates with the ICRC, with National Red Cross societies, and he used the opportunities to exchange with representatives of various enemy states in Bern. For instance, the ex-Hungarian minister Bakas Bessenye of Hungary, who had resigned after the appointment of the Stojan government. Therefore, we can say that we have a unique multinational and multi-stakeholder action in which Jewish organizations and humanitarian organizations, which are basically civil society organizations, play a very significant role, even from the point of view of information gathering, mobilization of financial resources. It's not the government who provide the financial resources, but these Jewish organizations. And they even will be the one who negotiate with the Nazis. It is not the neutral diplomats who only will negotiate, but we see Sally Meyer who will negotiate with Kurt Becher. We have Joël Brand who will have a diplomatic mission. We will have Rezo Kastner also entering into negotiations with the Nazis. They implement a set of instruments that had been identified and proposed by the Jewish organizations many months before. So it is not the result of a multilateral process that we have several instruments, but basically the Jewish organizations in the United States had proposed them. One of the main instruments is basically the threat. The threat, the promise of punishment, the encouragement to help the victims are considered as the most influential instrument, and they are based on the Roosevelt Declaration of 24th March 1944, where they could actually promise that they will punish those who are the perpetrators. They encourage the population also to protect. And when Professor Karjai was showing Becquet, Hendry, and Stojan, we must remember that they were hanged. This promise of punishment was not an empty promise. When we look at the toolbox for protection, we can say that we have political measures, including bombardments, if we might call them political, threats, we have appeals, we have diplomatic démarches, encouragement to stop the deportation and the persecutions with several collective démarches. We have negotiations with the Nazis, which were recognized as an instrument by the Jewish organizations already in 1943. We have, and they are essential for our neutral diplomats, we have the consular measures, which I will elaborate a little bit more. Consular protection, the protection as protective power, and this is the central element of the distribution of documents. We have humanitarian assistance, I cannot enter into details, financial assistance and legal assistance. We can say that these instruments, none of them is perfect. There is no perfect instrument which could be implemented, and I would like to say that until today, we don't have good instrument to protect the civilian population. And we celebrate 75 years of the Geneva Conventions. We have a convention against genocide. We can see in the world around us, there is no good instrument until now. These people, the Jewish organization, the neutral diplomats, they tried to implement measures which were not adapted instruments, but they tried to bring them together. All of these instruments already existed, have been implemented elsewhere, but what is absolutely unique is that they will implement them together, systematically, simultaneously. It is a collective international effort, and they produce some results, but no decisive results, and until now, 75 years after the Geneva Conventions, we have no instrument, and the Nuncio have reminded us of the terrible world in which we are still living. But this collective effort of the diverse instruments creates a new dynamic for rescue and protection. And we must consider all the actors together. We have a complex interaction between all these actors. Many actors have to change their policies, they have to cross red lines. For instance, the neutral countries like Switzerland, they decide to cooperate. Switzerland will change its policy towards refugees. They will transmit threats. They will accept admission of Jewish refugees. They will participate in efforts for the protection of Hungarian citizens, basically. ICRC will transmit political messages, which they don't do so often until now. They are part of a coalition of the willing. The Holy See and the Nuncio, they transmit not only appeals, but also condemnation. They speak on behalf of the future victors. The British Empire, they have a large-scale efforts to use the migration to Palestine as an instrument of protection against deportation, but they have a persistent reluctance towards effective large-scale migration. The Horthy regime, you said, Professor, they decide to suspend deportations, but with many hesitations. They accept at some point the request of neutral states for migrations. They have new objectives to switch sides, but they have also to take into account the evolution of the war. And the Germans, they have the objectives of spoliations. They can either destroy the population or exploit it, and they have always hesitations. So, the combined political and humanitarian components of the rescue effort influence the fate of the Jews in Budapest in three main moments. And I think the first moment is in June, May, June, July, when the political efforts basically contribute to the stopping the deportations. And if we take the next, of course, I want to show some documents. On 6 May of 1944, the former ambassador of Hungary to Bern, Bakas Bessenyé, sends a message to his colleagues. He's encouraged by McClelland from the War Refugee Board, and he explained that the War Refugee Board is not a charitable association. We must take it seriously. The governments of the big allies powers are behind the War Refugee Board. He mentions Romania, who has done considerable practical work and is ready to evacuate 40,000 Jews. 1.5 months later, after the meeting of the Crown Council with Regent Horthy, when the Hungarian Foreign Ministry sends a note to the German embassy, they say through the mediation of a third party, the American War Refugee Board has addressed itself to the Hungarian delegation in Bern, probably it is Bakas Bessenyé, and they also mention the fact that Romania is ready to help the removal of 40,000 Jews. Quite important because we see this number 40,000 coming from Romania and not from the deception effort of Karl Lutz or other neutral diplomats who interpreted 8,000 into 8,000 families. You mentioned, interesting second point, the same meeting, we see that when we look at the factors who contributed to the change of policy, to stopping the deportations, we see that in that note of 27 June, they say the government of Hungary has also examined the above factions from the following point of view. Sweden is the protective power of Hungary in almost all the enemy states, in particular in the British Empire and the USA, where we have a lot of significant, a great number of ethnic Hungarians. Some have a considerable wealth. And if we do not follow their request, this might have a negative effect for our own population. So what I want to demonstrate is that actually there are many factors which contribute to the change of policy, and they are state interests. They are state interests. It is not that somebody is fooling or outsmarting the Hungarian government. In a note of Ambassador Wesermeyer to the attention of Ribbentrop on the 6th of July, he mentions all a series of factors. You mentioned some of them, the bombardments, they fear the bombardment, the threat with concrete lists of perpetrators. There are a list of people who could be targeted. The situation in Romania, there is a rivalry with Romania, the political démarches, and the fear that the removal of the Jews of Budapest would incite bombardments. So I think these many factors brought together contribute to halting the deportation, not immediately, but later, and we can consider it is one of the best results of this humanitarian international diplomacy. There are huge efforts also to protect through consular measures, and I've tried to make a table. Basically, the neutral diplomats, how can they protect the Jews of Hungary or Budapest? They can protect, for instance, for the Vatican, the converts. They say, those Jews who are converted, we would like them to be protected. They can protect their own nationals. There are Jews in Hungary who are nationals from Switzerland. We will see that with Harald Feller. They can also protect those Jews who have special relationship with their country. And you mentioned, Professor, the Swedish Schutzpässe, protective pass. They are done for people who are not necessarily Swedes, but they have a relationship. And they can protect the employees. We should not forget that they delivered a lot of documents to the employees. For the ICRC, it was a huge number. But then, as a protecting power, and in this case it is mainly Switzerland, they can assist the British authorities with the transmission of lists protecting against deportation. The Swiss have helped in the German-Palestinian exchanges. They can then extend passports or deliver passports of protection to third country nationals, British citizens, American citizens. They can distribute Latin American passport, and the Salvadorian passport will be used quite extensively. They can assist the Palestine office for the emigration to Palestine. And interestingly, this possibility of emigration to Palestine gives the biggest opportunity, because the Swedes' protective passes, in June they say we could have 750. Later on, thanks to Wallenberg, they are more than 4,000. But in the case of Palestine, we have seen we can have up to 40,000. If we consider that we have 200,000 Jews in Budapest, we see that the proportion is higher. I would like to mention some documents which show that actually there was a long negotiation, and there were instructions which enabled the diplomats like Karl Lutz to issue protective passports. So one of the instructions is related to the issuance of protective passports to American or British or Yugoslav citizens. And what are the instructions of Karl Lutz? They tell him, well, if you have to establish a protection passport, you must ask to the authority of the protected power. But if the reply is late, if you don't have, you can extend the passport or protect the nationals for a certain period of time. And Karl Lutz is using this capacity actually to take initiatives. In terms of the protection letters, which are so important, you have shown them. If we look at the next, this is another example. We see this international diplomacy when it comes to the efforts to ensure effective migration to Palestine. We see the many actors involved. This is an American note to the from Washington to the American embassy in London. They mention the fact that the Jewish agency in Istanbul has received a message from the Jewish agency representative Kraus in Budapest. They say that Hungarian Jews will be able to migrate to Palestine through Switzerland and Portugal, and they ask actually the American embassy to verify with a representative of the War Refugee Board in Bern. The next one, we see the origin of the letters of protections of the Swiss diplomats. They are not a Swiss instruction, they are British instruction. The British authorities had established 25 lists of Jews who were authorized to migrate to Palestine. We had 8,400 names, and they say basically to ensure that those Jews who can migrate to Palestine should not be deported, we would like you to issue certificates to the effect that we can prove that they can go to Palestine. If they can go to Palestine, there is no need to bring them elsewhere. And the Swiss government says to the delegation, when you receive the text of this certificate, you are allowed to give them to all Jews whose names are carried on the 25 lists that Ankara transmitted to you on 13 June. And we have, in fact, go to the next one, because we have, in fact, 8,000 names with family. It means he has an instruction from the Swiss. He can distribute them to 40,000 people. I will terminate by saying that when the Arrow Crosses come into power, the real potential for the neutral diplomats who represent the big allies powers to be influential is a little bit lost, because the Hungarian government is not recognized, as you said, Professor, so the Swedish and Swiss diplomat, they didn't have a special capacity to say, be careful, because you will be punished. But the nuncio still has his moral authority, and we see that they mention the fact that they are acting as representative of the neutral powers. They cannot speak on behalf of the government or the American government, they are not recognized, but they say as well as their governments, and they mention the fact that the reception which the Hungarian government will give to this approach will not fail to have a great influence on their line of conduct towards the Hungarian people. So they still, under the nuncio leadership, exercise some sense of a threat. When the Arrow Cross Nilas start to kill randomly in the city, they must adapt the instruments, the not so valid instruments, and they try to multiply the letters of protection, not only them, but also those Zionists who are in the glass house. And Karl Lutz has a very difficult task, basically, because he has to make sure that the letters of protection are still respected. He must contribute to the selection of the real letters from the fake letters. And actually, at some point, he explained that he has been busy in concentration camps, brick factories, railway stations, searching the Jews with purple certificate to sort out those with false papers. And inside the protected houses, they also have, with the help of the police, to try to make a selection. So on the one side, to ensure that the system of exemptions continues to be respected, they have to participate in the selection, and it's not just one time. Here they mention many weeks. And on the other side, they themselves distribute letters. They try to protect the people, to take them out of the death marches. So I take this example as, I think that in the end, this big international diplomacy is not so successful because the instruments are not perfect, and they are not perfect until today, but ultimately the neutral diplomats who should not have been kept in Budapest because their government does not recognize the Holocaust regime, because the Holocaust regime is moving to Sopron, and in the end, the neutral countries, they recognize another government, Hungarian government in Debrecen in December. So our neutral diplomats should not have been kept in Hungary, in Budapest. You do not leave diplomats in Mariupol or other places. They should not have been kept here. No real diplomatic and humanitarian action was possible. They stay as a result of miscalculation from the government, and in the end, they embody these efforts, which were not so successful, but they managed themselves at the price of the risk for their lives, and sometimes at the cost of their lives, to achieve results. So this is, I think, a very nice story about that. They managed to embody themselves, at the risk of their own lives, an international effort which had started many months before, but had not been so successful. So we try a little bit to show that the mythology has to be put in place, to be put into the context, but we must praise these personalities for what they really did. Thank you very much, and thank you for leaving me a little bit more time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Now we have about 15 minutes or so reserved for questions and answers. So who would like to contribute? And the lady over there has a microphone and can approach you if you have a question or remark.
Lehetőség nyílik párbeszédre.
So I think both presentations have substantially enriched our knowledge about this crucial period of Hungarian history, and some of the information might have been new for some of you, so you might want to ask further questions or comments. Yes, but I think if there is a question and answer period, at least one question should be mentioned. If perhaps, may I ask one question to both of you? To what extent do you think new sources might be still available, both in Hungarian archives or in other archives, about this crucial period of Hungarian history?
Azt hiszem, hogy van még mit kutatni.
Yes, indeed, we still have many things to search for in the Hungarian National Archives. I think in 13 years I managed to finish my research that my father started decades ago. And that he, the documents are listed in his fourth volume. However, let me mention a person very close to my heart. It might be surprising. Pope Francis is a person who opened the Vatican archives. Last year I had the opportunity to do research in these archives, and in this very short period of time I managed to find 16 documents which haven't been published so far. And if everything goes well, then in around January, these are going to be published in Hungarian translation. So the Vatican archives are a place fantastic for research, and to tell the truth, I'm a really optimistic person, and I do hope and I do believe that sooner or later the Wallenberg family archives will also be opened for the public.
I think the question of the sources is a very important one. Once the Swedish diplomat Paula Levine said, in order to be able to evaluate the action of the neutral diplomats, we would need a group, an international group of diplomats, because you should read Hungarian, you should read Swedish, you could, and actually I think it is true. It is necessary to have access to the diplomatic archives of many states. In my case, the American archives of the War Refugee Board were essential. because we find the archives of Roosevelt McClellan in Bern, and it is what we call the Handakten. It is not the archives that archivists have brought in different folders. We have everything is everyday activities. When Dr. Halash was looking at these archives, they were not available online, but now we can find them online, but you still have 19,000 of them, so you need. The Swiss archives are useful when you speak about the Swiss diplomats, but they are a little bit difficult to find in different folders. Many of them are available online. There are, I think, few archives available from the British diplomatic archives, but we find those British documents in the Swiss archives, because the interest of diplomatic correspondence is that you have the Germans document in the Hungarian archives. I thought in Vadirat, in your books and your father's book, many important German documents, but basically your question was, are we hoping to find new archives? I think yes. But at some point, and I say that very humbly because I've started only 3 years ago, at some point you have a sense whether or not new document will change totally or not your perception. Because Professor Karjai, with a very large experience, looking at the German, the Hungarian archives, and I'm weak in the Hungarian and German archives, but I've looked at the American and the Swiss one, we somehow arrive at the same conclusions. But I'm sure that the diplomatic archives of the Vatican are important. ICRC archives, we should look at the Spanish archives, but we will know more about that later. So I'm sure there are still important archives. We have, of course, the oral testimonies of survivors, which have been worked upon very intensively. And then you have the diplomatic archives. The Swedish archives are extremely important. They have been researched, but to have access would offer us new documents. But it takes an enormous amount of time. This is why I'm happy to retire in a couple of months.
Oh, thank you very much. Oh, perhaps there is one question. Okay, go ahead.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to raise questions. I'd like to ask a question from Professor Karsai. I'm not a historian. I'm the daughter of 2 Holocaust survivors. So who saved the Budapest Jews? Because for me, the situation is not clear-cut. So for whom shall I express my gratitude for existing? And the Swiss government officially, how much supported the diplomats, so I mean officially. So I'm not interested in their personal humanitarian activities, but how much could the Swiss government officially support their diplomats? Thank you very much for your question. I try to look behind your question, also as son of a Holocaust survivor. It is my father I'm speaking about, and maybe it's a human weakness. I have to tell you that my mother and my maternal mother and my maternal grandmother and my maternal grandfather received the right, the righteous among the nations. I didn't know that my fascist grandfather was working, my grandfather was working with Wallenberg and saving Jews. I tried to summarize the answer in 50 pages in Yad Vashem studies in English and in Hebrew. So I think I also wrote some 70-80 pages about this subject in my book about Ferenc Szálasi. And when, several years ago, I dared to say that For the Jews, it was better to stay under the Arab Cross government in Budapest than under the Stolyai government. And then, you know, there was a huge explosion in the internet because of this statement of mine. And let me rephrase it. So when this statement of mine was published, you know, I didn't mean that it was good for the Jews here. Of course, it was not good. It was extremely bad. However, the opportunity for the Jews to survive under the Arab Cross movement was higher than under the Stolyai movement. And then, back then, when it was published, I was called by the Hungarian Jewish Association, and he received lots of phone calls, and he couldn't answer that I became insane, because many said that I became insane. They couldn't say that I was anti-Semitic, but I was told to rehabilitate Szálasi. Of course, I don't want to rehabilitate Szálasi. I have lots of books which are stating just the same, but Gustav Zoltai asked me, how dare to say that? And what is the problem, I asked? Can you imagine the international ghetto in a protective house? You know, we were taken to the big ghetto and we had to hold our hands 1.5 kilometers. Can you imagine how what it was like? And I answered, Gusti, I can imagine it was a tragic journey. However, can you imagine that my paternal grandmother, how tiresome successful journey was to walk to the gas chambers in Auschwitz-Birkenau. My paternal grandmother has no recollections and no memories. And you know, Gusti, who were the ones from your family who survived the Holocaust? Everyone, but it was very difficult, and there were many people who were hit to death. Yes, figures, yeah. 437,000 Jews were deported in a couple of weeks from the countryside. However, in Budapest, 10 to 12,000 Jews were killed and shot to the Danube. But you know, there's a huge difference. There's a difference of magnitude. Of course, the Szálasi government was impossible to solve the problems that wouldn't have existed without them. But there were no massacres, there were no raping of women during the horrid Stolyai government. So, of course, there were some tortures, especially if it was about some wealthy Jew. However, you know, when after 1945, it was mentioned that there were some crazy people who were rallying freely in the street. Yes, there were some torturing, killing people, but it was not mass massacre. Szálasi indeed can be considered from a certain aspect. So he created a system which was much more easy to endure than the Stolyai government. And well, so if I have some time, then, you know, I could speak for about 170 minutes, but I would rather not do so. But if my study was okay for the Yad Vashem studies, you know, I've been member of the Hungarian Academy of Sciences because of my book on Szálasi. And, you know, my approach has been approached by the profession, you know. Back in the past, Szálasi was the biggest scapegoat. But one single sentence, if somebody during the Stolyai government was placed in an important position, you know, gendarme leaders managed to survive who participated in the anti-Jewish movement. So, but whoever was was placed in the higher position during the Soviet government was placed into prison. And even though they didn't do anything, they were in prison for 15 years. You know, the most important scapegoats became the Eurocross members. Just like in Romania, just a handful of Eurocross members, and that's all. Just go to Szabadság Square and have a look at the German occupation memorial. This is exactly what it shows.
Official support. As I said at the beginning, diplomats do not work only on the basis of instructions, precise instructions. Maybe the German or French ambassador, they receive more instructions than I do because they work for big countries. But we are mainly working in order to realize the objectives, the foreign policy objectives of our government. In the case of Switzerland, I am surprised, I must say, to see how quickly the federal government starts to cooperate rather willingly with the War Refugee Board. They understand that it is their interest, and it was a surprise for me that those politicians like Pilegola or Rothmund were in favor of adapting Switzerland to Nazi Germany somehow in June 1940. They understand, starting in March, April, May, June 1944, that now we will have an American world or Europe, an American Europe, and they understand that they must adapt to this new reality. And they work rather willingly with the American War Refugee Board. Those who are in the driving seat in Bern, in terms of these initiatives, they are the Americans. But the Swiss collaborate rather willingly, and it is very interesting, and this you don't find in the Swiss archive, you will find in the War Refugee Board archives. They are in contact with the Foreign Ministry of Switzerland every day, almost, because Switzerland is representing their interest. And what is fascinating is that you had the Jewish organization in the United States who was defining instruments, but they must rely on their own representatives on the ground. The Americans must rely on the neutral diplomats, on the Swiss diplomats, but they also ask support from the Vatican because they have no representation on the spot. So the objectives to help the Jews and to collaborate with the Americans is present very quickly, I would say March, April already. A change in the Swiss policy towards refugees, basically that Jews were not considered to be political refugees, the actual change happens in July. And what is fascinating in this international diplomacy is that you see, you don't have a quick turning point. You have many actors who change their mind, who adapt their policy during many months. And something I would like to say is that for many actors who had accepted that maybe Hitler will win, and if Hitler will win, you cannot do anything for the Jewish population. In the spring of 1944, and after the debarkment in Normandy, everybody almost accepts that Nazi Germany has lost. So there is a sign of, they do not accept anymore, you know, something that was finally accepted. They understand that there will be no 1,000 years Reich. So the destruction of the European Jews is not just a monstrosity, it is also a stupidity, because it will never happen. This monstrous goal will never happen. So it is interesting to see actors like Rothmund in Switzerland, who was the one who implemented the Boot ist voll policy in 1942. The ship is full, we cannot take more. They become really upset. And at some point, he asked the Swiss ambassador to Germany to threaten a state secretary. He says, look, now I want him to free the catch-the-train Jews who will arrive in Switzerland in December. Now I want him to free them, and please remind him that I am the one who gave visa to his wife and son. And he wouldn't like his authorities to know about that. So you see this sense of what was, after all, accepted suddenly becomes unacceptable. But there are state interests also behind this change of policy in Switzerland. They are criticized because of the economic relations with the Third Reich. So you can see both, you know. But they follow state interest at the same time. They do not accept anymore something which is not just monstrous, but becomes also somehow ridiculous. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I'm really sorry for taking and delaying the coffee break, but I think it was worth listening to these answers. I'm really sorry. In the coffee break, you will have the opportunity to ask questions if you wish from the participants, from the speakers, and after approximately 15 minutes coffee break, we're going to resume, and Peter Tschunderli is going to be in my seat as a moderator. Thank you so much.